The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 3, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 8, Side 1. They left Astrolabe with the sister, returned to Paris, and were married in the presence of Fulbert. To keep the marriage secret, Abelard went back to his bachelor lodgings, and Heloise lived again with her uncle. The lovers saw each other now only rarely and clandestinely. But Fulbert, anxious to redeem his prestige and overruling his promise to Abelard, divulged the marriage. Heloise denied it, and Fulbert visited her repeatedly with punishments. Abelard stole her away again. This time he sent her, much against her will, to the convent at Argenteuil, and bade her don the garb of a nun, but not to take the vows or the veil. When Fulbert and his kinsmen heard of this, says Abelard, they were convinced that now I had completely played them false, and had rid myself forever of Heloise by forcing her to become a nun. Violently incensed, they laid a plot against me, and one night, while I was asleep in a secret room in my lodgings, they broke in with the help of one of my servants whom they had bribed. There they had vengeance upon me with a most cruel and shameful punishment, for they cut off those parts of my body whereby I had done that which was the cause of their sorrow. This done, they fled, but 2 of them were captured, and suffered the loss of their eyes and their genitals. His enemies could not have chosen a subtler revenge. It did not immediately disgrace him. All Paris, including the clergy, sympathized with him. His students flocked to comfort him. Fulbert shrank into hiding and oblivion, and the bishop confiscated his property. But Abelard realized that he was ruined, and that the tale of this amazing outrage would spread to the very ends of the earth. He could no longer think of ecclesiastical preferment. He felt that his fair fame had been utterly blotted out, and that he would be a butt of jokes for generations to come. He felt a certain unpoetic justice in his fall. He had been maimed in the flesh that had sinned, and had been betrayed by the man whom he had betrayed. He bade Heloise take the veil, and he himself at Saint-Denis took the vows of a monk. 3. The Rationalist. A year later, in 1120, at the urging of his students and his abbot, he resumed his lecturing in a cell of the Benedictine priory of Maisoncelles. Presumably we have the substance of his lecture courses in his books. These, however, were composed in hectic installments, and hardly allowed dating. They were revised in his final years, when his spirit was quite broken, and there is no telling how much youthful fire was quenched by the flow of time. 4 minor logical works circle about the problem of universals. We need not disturb their rest. The Dialectica, however, is a 375-page treatise on logic in the Aristotelian sense, a rational analysis of the parts of speech, the categories of thought, substance, quantity, place, position, time, relation, quality, possession, action, passion, the forms of propositions, and the rules of reasoning. The renascent mind of Western Europe had to clarify these basic ideas for itself like a child learning to read. Dialectic was the major interest of philosophy in Abelard's time, partly because the new philosophy stemmed from Aristotle through Boethius and Porphyry, and only the logical treatises of Aristotle, and not all of these, were known to this first generation of scholastic philosophy. So the Dialectica is not a fascinating book, yet even in its formal pages we hear a shot or two in the first skirmishes of a 200 years' war between faith and reason. How can we, in an age already doubtful of the intellect, recapture the glow of a time that was just discovering this great mystery of knowledge? Truth cannot be contrary to truth, Abelard pleads. The truths of Scripture must agree with the findings of reason, else the God who gave us both would be deluding us with one or the other. Perhaps in his early period, before his tragedy, he wrote his Dialogue between a Philosopher, a Jew, and a Christian. In a vision of the night, he says, 3 men came to him as a famous teacher, and asked his judgment on their dispute. All 3 believe in one God, 2 accept the Hebrew Scriptures. The philosopher rejects these and proposes to base life and morality on reason and natural law. How absurd, argues the philosopher, to cling to the beliefs of our childhood, to share the superstitions of the crowd, and to condemn to hell those who do not accept these puerilities. He ends unphilosophically by calling Jews fools and Christians lunatics. The Jew replies that men could not live without laws, that God, like a good king, gave man a code of conduct, and that the precepts of the Pentateuch sustained the courage and morality of the Jews through centuries of dispersion and tragedy. The philosopher asks, how then did your patriarchs live so nobly long before Moses and his laws? And how can you believe in a revelation that promised you earthly prosperity, and yet has allowed you to suffer such poverty and desolation? The Christian accepts much that the philosopher and the Jew have said, but he argues that Christianity developed and perfected the natural law of the one and the Mosaic law of the other. Christianity raised higher than ever before the moral ideals of mankind. Neither philosophy nor scriptural Judaism offered man eternal happiness. Christianity gives harassed man such a hope, and is therefore infinitely precious. This unfinished dialogue is an amazing product for a cathedral canon in the Paris of 1120. A like freedom of discussion found another medium in Abelard's most famous work, Sic et Non, Yes and No, from possibly 1120. The earliest known mention of it is in a letter from William of Saint-Thierry to St. Bernard in 1140, describing it as a suspicious book secretly circulating among the pupils and partisans of Abelard. Thereafter, it disappeared from history until 1836, when the manuscript was discovered by Victor Cousin in a library at Avranches. Its very form must have made the mitred grieve. After a pious introduction, it divided into 157 questions, including the most basic dogmas of the faith. Under each question, 2 sets of quotations were ranged in opposite columns. One set supported the affirmative, the other the negative, and each set quoted from the Bible, the Fathers of the Church, the pagan classics, even from Ovid's Art of Loving, Ars Amandi. The book may have been intended as an armory of references for scholastic disputation, but the introduction, purposely or not, impugned the authority of the Fathers by showing them in contradiction of one another, even of themselves. Abelard did not question the authority of the Bible, but he argued that its language was meant for unlettered people and must be interpreted by reason, that the sacred text had sometimes been corrupted by interpolation or careless copying, and that where scriptural or patristic passages contradicted one another, reason must attempt their reconciliation. Anticipating the Cartesian doubt by 400 years, he wrote in the same prologue, "The first key to wisdom is assiduous and frequent questioning, for by doubting we come to inquiry, and by inquiry we arrive at the truth." He points out that Jesus himself, facing the doctors in the temple, plied them with questions. The first debate in the book is almost a declaration of independence for philosophy, that faith should be founded in human reason and the contrary. He quotes Ambrose, Augustine, and Gregory I as defending faith, and cites Hilary, Jerome, and Augustine to the effect that it is good to be able to prove one's faith by reason. While repeatedly affirming his orthodoxy, Abelard opens up for debate such problems as divine providence versus free will, the existence of sin and evil in a world created by a good and omnipotent God, and the possibility that God is not omnipotent. His free reasoning about such questions must have shaken the faith of youthful students enamored of debate. Nevertheless, this method of education by the freest discussion became, probably through Abelard's example, the regular procedure at French universities and in philosophical or theological writing. We shall find St. Thomas adopting it without fear and without reproach. In the very birth of scholasticism, rationalism found a place. If the sic et non offended only a few because its circulation was limited, Abelard's attempt to apply reason to the mystery of the Trinity could not so narrowly confine its influence and alarm, for it was the subject of his lectures in 1120 and of his book on the divine unity and Trinity. He wrote this, he says, "for my students, because they were always seeking for rational and philosophical explanations, asking rather for reasons they could understand than for mere words, saying that it was futile to utter words which the intellect could not possibly follow, that nothing could be believed unless it could first be understood, and that it was absurd for anyone to preach to others a thing which he neither himself nor those whom he sought to teach could comprehend." This book, he tells us, became exceedingly popular, and people marveled at his subtlety. He pointed out that the unity of God was the one point agreed upon by the greatest religions and the greatest philosophers. In the one God we may view his power as the first person, his wisdom as the second, his grace, charity, and love as the third. These are phases or modalities of the divine essence. but all the works of God suppose and unite at once his power, his wisdom, and his love. Many theologians felt that this was a permissible analogy. The Bishop of Paris rejected the appeal of the now aged and orthodox Rosselin to indict Abelard for heresy, and Bishop Geoffrey of Chartres defended Abelard through all the fury that now fell upon the reckless philosopher. But in Reims, two teachers, Alberic and Lutolf, who had quarreled with Abelard at Laon in 1113, stirred up the archbishop to summon him to come to Soissons with his book on the Trinity, and defend himself against charges of heresy. When Abelard appeared at Soissons in 1121, he found that the populace had been roused against him, and came near to stoning me in the belief that I had preached the existence of three gods. The Bishop of Chartres demanded that Abelard be heard by the council in his own defense. Alberic and others objected, on the ground that Abelard was irresistible in persuasion and argument. The council condemned him unheard, compelled him to cast his book into a fire, and bade the abbot of Saint-Médard to confine him in that monastery for a year. But shortly thereafter, a papal legate freed him and sent him back to Saint-Denis. After a turbulent year with the unruly monks there, Abelard secured permission from the new abbot, the great Suger, to build himself a hermitage in a lonely spot halfway between Fontainebleau and Troyes in 1122. There, with a companion in minor orders, he raised with reeds and stalks a little oratory or place of prayer, which he called by the name of the Holy Trinity. When students heard that he was free to teach again, they came to him and made themselves into an impromptu school. They built huts in the wilderness, slept on rushes and straw, and lived on coarse bread and the herbs of the field. Here was a thirst for knowledge that would soon make and crowd universities. Now, indeed, the Dark Ages were a nightmare almost forgotten. In return for his lectures, the students tilled the field, raised buildings, and built him a new oratory of timber and stone, which he called the Paraclete, as if to say that the affection of his disciples had come like a Holy Spirit into his life just when he had fled from human society to solitude and despair. The 3 years that he spent there were as happy as any that he could now know. Probably the lectures that he gave to those eager students are preserved and reshaped in 2 books, one called Theologia Christiana, and the other simply Theologia. Their doctrine was orthodox, but an age still a stranger to most of Greek philosophy was a bit shocked to find in them so many laudatory references to pagan thinkers, and a suggestion that Plato too had in some degree enjoyed divine inspiration. He could not believe that all these wonderful pre-Christian minds had missed salvation. God, he insisted, gives his love to all peoples, Jews and heathen included. Abelard impenitently returned to the defense of reason in theology and argued that heretics should be restrained by reason rather than by force. Those who recommend faith without understanding are in many cases seeking to cover up their inability to teach the faith intelligibly. Here was a barb that must have pierced some skins. In attempting a rationale of Christianity, Abelard might seem to have dared no more than what Alexander of Hales, Albertus Magnus, and Thomas Aquinas would essay after him. But whereas even the brave Thomas would leave the Trinity and the creation in time to a faith beyond or above reason, Abelard sought to embrace the most mystic doctrines of the Church within the grasp of reason. The audacity of the enterprise and the sharpness of his reviving wit brought him new enemies. Probably referring to Bernard of Clairvaux and Norbert, founder of the Premonstratensian order, he writes, "Certain new apostles in whom the world put great faith ran hither and yon, shamelessly slandering me in every way they could, so that in time they succeeded in drawing down upon my head the scorn of many having authority. God is my witness that whensoever I learned that a new assemblage of the clergy was convened, I believed that it was done for the express purpose of my condemnation." Perhaps to silence such criticism, he abandoned his teaching and accepted an invitation to be the abbot of the monastery of St. Gildas in Brittany, possibly in 1125. More likely, the politic Suger had arranged the transfer in the hope of quieting the storm. It was at once a promotion and an imprisonment. The philosopher found himself amid a barbarous and unintelligible population, among monks vile and untamable, who openly lived with concubines. Resenting his reforms, the monks put poison in the chalice from which he drank at Mass. This failing, they bribed his servant to poison his food. Another monk ate the food and straightway fell dead. But Abelard is our sole authority here. He fought this battle bravely enough, for, with some interruptions, He remained in this lonely post for 11 years. 4. The Letters of Heloise. He had an interlude of moderate happiness when Suger decided to use for other purposes than a nunnery the house at Argenteuil. Since her separation from Abelard, Heloise had so devoted herself there to her duties as a nun that she had been made prioress, and had won such favor in the eyes of all that the bishops loved her as a daughter, the abbots as a sister, and the laity as a mother. Learning that Heloise and her nuns were looking for new quarters, Abelard offered them the oratory and buildings of the Paraclete. He went in person to help establish them there, and frequently visited them to preach to them and the villagers who had settled nearby. Gossip murmured that I, who of old could scarcely endure to be parted from her whom I loved, was still swayed by the delights of earthly lust. It was during his troubled abbacy at St. Gildas that he composed his autobiography, Historia Calamitatum Mearum, possibly from 1133. We do not know its motive. It assumed the guise of an essay in consolation offered to a plaintive friend, so that in comparing your sorrows with mine you may discover that yours are in truth naught. But apparently it was intended for the world, as both a moral confession and a theological defense. An old but unverifiable tradition says that a copy of it came to Heloise, and that she wrote this astonishing reply: To her master, nay father, to her husband, nay brother, his handmaid, nay daughter, his spouse, nay sister, to Abelard, Heloise. Your letter written to a friend for his comfort, beloved, was lately brought to me by chance, which things I deem that no one can read or hear with dry eyes, for they renewed in fuller measure my griefs. In his name who still protects thee, in the name of Christ, as his handmaids and thine, we beseech thee to deign to inform us by frequent letters of those shipwrecks in which thou still art tossed, that thou mayest have us, at least, who alone have remained to thee as partners in thy grief or joy. Thou knowest, dearest, all men know, what I have lost in thee. Obeying thy command, I changed both my habit and my heart, that I might show thee to be the possessor of both my body and my mind. Not for the pledge of matrimony, nor for any dowry did I look, and if the name of wife appears more sacred and valid, sweeter to me is ever the word friend, or, if thou be not ashamed, concubine or whore. I call God to witness, if Augustus, ruling over the whole world, were to deem me worthy of the honor of marriage, and to confirm the whole world to me, to be ruled by me forever, dearer to me and of greater dignity would it seem to be called thy strumpet than his empress. For who among kings or philosophers could equal thee in fame? What kingdom or city or village would not burn to see thee? Who, I ask, did not hasten to gaze upon thee when thou appearedst in public? What wife, what maiden did not yearn for thee in thine absence, nor burn in thy presence? What queen or powerful lady did not envy me my joys and my bed? Tell me one thing only, if thou canst. Why, after our conversion to the religious life, which thou alone didst decree, I am fallen into such neglect and oblivion with thee that I am neither refreshed by thy speech and presence, nor comforted by a letter in thine absence? Tell me one thing only, if thou canst, or let me tell thee what I feel, nay, what all suspect. Concupiscence joined thee to me rather than affection. When, therefore, what thou hadst desired ceased, all that thou hadst exhibited at the same time failed. This, most beloved, is not mine only, but the conjecture of all. Would that it seemed thus to me only, and thy love found others to excuse it, by whom my grief might be a little quieted. Attend, I beseech thee, to what I ask. While I am cheated of thy presence, at least by written words, whereof thou hast abundance, present the sweetness of thine image. I deserved more from thee, having done all things for thee. I, who as a girl was allured to the asperity of monastic conversion, not by religious devotion, but by thy command alone. No reward for this may I expect from God, for the love of whom it is well known that I did not anything. And so in his name to whom thou hadst offered thyself, before God I beseech thee that in whatsoever way thou canst, thou restore to me thy presence by writing to me some word of comfort. Farewell, my all. Abelard was physiologically incapacitated from responding to such passion in kind. The reply that tradition assigns to him is a reminder of religious vows. To Heloise, his dearly beloved sister in Christ, Abelard her brother in the same. He counsels her to accept their misfortunes humbly, as a cleansing and saving punishment from God. He asks for her prayers, bids her assuage her grief with the hope of their reunion in heaven, and begs her to bury him when he is dead in the grounds of the Paraclete. Her second letter repeats her fond impieties. I have ever feared to offend thee rather than God. I seek to please thee more than him. See how unhappy a life I must lead, if I endure all these things in vain, having no hope of reward in the future. For a long time thou, like many others, hast been deceived by my simulation, so as to mistake hypocrisy for religion. He answers that Christ, not he, truly loved her. My love was concupiscence, not love. I satisfied my wretched desires in thee, and this was all that I loved. Weep for thy Saviour, not for thy seducer, for thy Redeemer, not for thy defiler. And he composes a touching prayer which he asks her to recite for him. Her third letter shows her resigned to the earthly death of his love. She asked him now only for a new rule by which she and her nuns might live properly the religious life. He complied, and drew up for them a kindly moderate code. He wrote sermons for their edification, and sent these compositions to Heloise over a tender signature. Farewell in the Lord to his servant, once dear to me in the world, now most dear in Christ. In his own broken heart he still loved her. Are these famous letters genuine? The difficulties leap to the eye. The first letter of Heloise purports to follow upon his Historia Calamitatum, which records several visits of Abelard to Heloise at the Paraclete. Yet she complains that he has ignored her. Possibly the Historia was issued in installments, and only the earlier parts preceded the letter. The bold carnality of certain passages seems incredible in a woman whose religious devotion through 14 years had already earned her the high and general regard which we find attested by Peter the Venerable, as well as by Abelard. There are artifices of rhetoric in these letters, and pedantic quotations from the classics and the fathers, which would hardly occur to a mind sincerely feeling love or piety or remorse. The oldest manuscripts of the letters date from the 13th century. Jean de Meung appears to have translated them from Latin into French in 1285. We may provisionally conclude that they are among the most brilliant forgeries in history, unreliable in fact, but an imperishable part of the Romantic literature of France. 5. The Condemned. We do not know when or how Abelard escaped from the dignities and trials of his abbacy. We find John of Salisbury reporting that in 1136 he had attended Abelard's lectures on Mont Sainte-Geneviève. Nor do we know by what license he had resumed his teaching. Perhaps he had asked none. It may be that some flouting of church discipline set ecclesiastics against him, and by a devious route led to his final fall. If emasculation had unmanned him, there is no sign of it in the works that have transmitted to us the substance of his teaching. It is difficult to find explicit heresy in them, but easy to discover passages that must have made churchmen fret. In a book of moral philosophy entitled Cito te ipsum, Know Thyself, he argued that sin lies not in the act but in the intention. No act, not even killing, is sinful in itself. So a mother, having too little clothing to warm her babe, pressed it against her bosom and unwittingly suffocated it. She killed the thing she loved, and was properly punished by the law to make other women more careful. But in the eyes of God she was sinless. Furthermore, that there should be sin, the agent must violate his own moral conscience, not merely that of others. Hence the killing of Christian martyrs was not a sin in Romans who felt such persecution necessary to the preservation of their state, or of a religion which seemed to them true. Nay, those even who persecuted Christ or his followers, whom they considered it their duty to persecute, are said to have sinned in action, but they would have committed a graver fault if, contrary to their conscience, they had spared them. All this might be logical as well as irritating, but on such a theory the whole doctrine of sin as a violation of God's law threatened to go up in a haze of casuistry about intentions. Who but a few Pauls would admit that he had acted against his own conscience? Of the 16 excerpts for which Abelard was condemned in 1141, 6 were taken from this book. What disturbed the Church more than any specific heresy in Abelard was his assumption that there were no mysteries in the faith, that all dogmas should be capable of rational explanation. Was he not so drunk with the lees of logic that he had dared to connect it with the Logos, the Word of God, as a science almost divine? Granted that this seductive teacher arrived by unorthodox methods at orthodox conclusions, how many immature minds infected by him with the logic-chopping germ must have been by his specious pros and cons unsettled on the way. If he had been the only one of his kind, he might have been left untouched, in the hope that he would not take too long to die. But he had hundreds of eager followers, and there were other teachers, William of Conches, Gilbert de la Porree, Béranger of Tours, who were also summoning the faith to trial by reason. How long on this procedure could the Church maintain that unity and fervor of religious belief on which the moral and social order of Europe seemed to rest? Already one of Abelard's pupils, Arnold of Brescia, was fomenting revolution in Italy. Probably it was considerations like these that finally brought St. Bernard into open war with Abelard. The eager watchdog of the faith scented the wolf with the flock and led the pack to the hunt. He had long looked with distrust upon the prowling, invading, audacious intellect. To seek knowledge except as ministering to sanctity seemed to him plain paganism. To attempt to explain the sacred mysteries by reason was impiety and folly, and the same rationalism that began by explaining these mysteries would end by desecrating them. The saint was not truculent. When, in 1139, William of Saint-Thierry, a monk of Reims, called his attention to the dangers in Abelard's teaching and begged him to denounce the philosopher, he put the monk off and did nothing. Abelard himself precipitated matters by writing to the Archbishop of Sens, asking that at the coming church council there he should be given an opportunity to defend himself against the charges of heresy that were being circulated about him. The archbishop agreed, not unwilling to have his see become the cynosure of the Christian world. And to ensure a good fight he invited Bernard to attend. Bernard refused, saying that in the dialectical game he would be a mere child against an Abelard trained in logic through 40 years. But he wrote to several bishops, urging them to attend and defend the faith. Peter Abelard is trying to make void the merit of Christian faith when he deems himself able by human reason to comprehend God altogether. He ascends to the heavens and descends even to the abyss. Nothing may hide from him. Not content to see things through a glass darkly, he must behold all things face to face. He savors of Arius when he speaks of the Trinity, of Pelagius when he speaks of grace, of Nestorius when he speaks of the person of Christ. The faith of the righteous believes, it does not dispute. But this man has no mind to believe what his reason has not previously argued. Bernard's allies, pleading their own weakness, prevailed upon him to attend. When Abelard arrived at Sens, in June of 1140, he found the public mood, as at Soissons 19 years before, so set against him by the mere presence and hostility of Bernard that he hardly dared appear in the streets. The archbishop realized his dream. For a week Sens seemed the center of the world. The King of France was present with his ceremonious court, scores of church dignitaries were on hand, and Bernard, crippled with rheumatism and stern with sanctity, overawed all. Some of these prelates had felt the sting, in person or collectively, of Abelard's attacks upon the shortcomings of the clergy, the immorality of priests and monks, the sale of indulgences, the invention of bogus miracles. Convinced that the judgment of the council would condemn him, Abelard appeared at its first session, announced that he would accept none but the Pope as his judge, and left the assembly and the town. The council was not sure, after this appeal from it, that it could legally try Abelard. Bernard reassured it, and it proceeded to condemn 16 propositions from Abelard's books, including his definition of sin and his theory of the Trinity as the power, wisdom, and love of the one God. Almost penniless, Abelard set out for Rome to lay his case before the Pope. Age and infirmity retarded him. Reaching the monastery of Cluny in Burgundy, he was received with compassion and solicitude by Peter the Venerable, and rested there a few days. Meanwhile, Innocent II issued a decree confirming the sentence of the council, imposing perpetual silence upon Abelard, and ordering his confinement in a monastery. Abelard wished nevertheless to continue his pilgrimage. Peter dissuaded him, saying that the Pope would never decide against Bernard. Weary to physical and spiritual exhaustion, Abelard yielded. He became a monk at Cluny and hid himself in the obscurity of its walls and its ritual. He edified his fellow monks by his piety, his silence, and his prayers. He wrote to Heloise, whom he never saw again, a touching profession of faith in the teachings of the Church. He composed, probably for her, one of the most beautiful hymns in medieval literature. One plaint, ascribed to him, is formally a lament of David for Jonathan, but any reader will catch tender overtones in it. If I might lie in one same grave with thee, happily would I die, since of all gifts that earthly love can give, no greater boon know I. That I should live when thou art cold and dead would be unceasing death, nor in my wraith would half a soul suffice to life or half a breath. I let the harp lie still, would that I might so still my tears and plaints. My hands are sore with striking, sore my throat with grief, my spirit faints. Soon thereafter he fell ill, and his kindly abbot sent him to the priory of Saint Marcel near Chalons for a change of air. There, on April 21st, 1142, he died, aged 63. He was buried in the priory chapel, but Heloise reminded Peter the Venerable that Abelard had asked to be interred at the Paraclete. The good abbot brought the body to her himself, tried to comfort her by speaking of her dead lover as the Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle of his time, and left with her a letter rich in Christian tenderness. Thus, dear and venerable sister in God, him to whom you were united, after your tie in the flesh, by the better and stronger bond of divine love, and with whom you have served the Lord, him the Lord now takes in your stead, or as another you, and warms in his bosom. And for the day of his coming, when shall sound the voice of the archangel and the trumpet descending from heaven, he keeps him to restore him to you by his grace. She joined her dead lover in 1164, having lived to equal his age and almost his fame. She was buried beside him in the gardens of the Paraclete. That oratory was destroyed in the Revolution, and the graves were disturbed and perhaps confused. What were reasonably believed to be the remains of Abelard and Heloise were transferred to Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris in 1817. There, even till our time, men and women might be seen, on a summer day, bringing flowers to adorn the tomb. Chapter 36. The Adventure of Reason, 1120 to 1308. 1. The School of Chartres. How shall we explain the remarkable outburst of philosophy that began with Anselm, Rosselin, and Abelard, and culminated in Albertus Magnus and St. Thomas Aquinas? As usual, many causes conspired. The Greek East had never surrendered its classical heritage. The ancient philosophers were studied in every century in Constantinople, Antioch, and Alexandria. Men like Michael Pacellus, Nicephorus Blemmydes, possibly from 1197 to 1272, George Pachymeres, from 1242 to 1310, and the Syrian Bar Hebraeus, from 1226 to 1282, knew the works of Plato and Aristotle at first hand, and Greek teachers and manuscripts gradually entered the West. Even there, some fragments of the Hellenic legacy had survived the barbarian storm. Most of Aristotle's organon of logic remained, and of Plato the Meno and the Timaeus, whose vision of had colored Christian imaginations of hell. The successive waves of translations from the Arabic and the Greek in the 12th and 13th centuries brought to the West the revelation and challenge of Greek and Moslem philosophies, so different from the Christian that they threatened to sweep away the whole theology of Christendom unless Christianity could construct a counter-philosophy. But these influences would hardly have produced a Christian philosophy if the West had continued poor. What brought these factors to effect was the growth of wealth through the agricultural conquest of the continent, the expansion of commerce and industry, the services and accumulations of finance. This economic revival collaborated with the liberation of the communes, the rise of the universities, the rebirth of Latin literature and Roman law, the codification of canon law, the glory of Gothic, the flowering of romance, the gay science of the troubadours, the awakening of science, and the resurrection of philosophy, to constitute the Renaissance of the 12th century. From wealth came leisure, study, schools. Schole at first meant leisure. A scholasticus was a director or professor of a school. The scholastic philosophy was the philosophy taught in the medieval secondary schools or in the universities that for the most part grew out of them. The scholastic method was the form of philosophical argument and exposition used in such schools. In the 12th century, barring Abelard's classes in or near Paris, Chartres was the most active and famous of these schools. There, philosophy was combined with literature, and the graduates managed to write of abstruse problems with the clarity and grace that became an honorable tradition in France. Plato, who also had made philosophy intelligible, was a favorite there, and the quarrel between realists and nominalists was mediated by identifying the real universals with the Platonic ideas or creative archetypes in the mind of God. Under Bernard of Chartres, circa 1117, and his brother Theodoric, circa 1140, the school of Chartres reached the height of its influence. 3 of its graduates dominated the philosophical scene in Western Europe in the half-century after Abelard: William of Conches, Gilbert de la Porree, and John of Salisbury. The widening of the scholastic ken is startlingly revealed in William of Conches, possibly from 1080 to 1154. Here was a man who knew the works of Hippocrates, Lucretius, Hunayn ibn Ishaq, Constantine the African, even Democritus. He was fascinated by the atomic theory. All the works of nature, he concluded, originate in combinations of atoms, and this is true even of the highest vital processes of the human body. The soul is a union of the vital principle of the individual with the cosmic soul or vital principle of the world. Following Abelard into a dangerous mystery, William writes, "There is in the Godhead power, wisdom, and will, which the saints call 3 persons." He takes with a large grain of allegory the story that Eve was created from Adam's rib. He answers vigorously a certain Cornificius and other Cornificians, who condemned science and philosophy on the ground that simple faith sufficed. Because they know not the forces of nature, and in order that they may have comrades in their ignorance, they suffer not that others should search out anything, and would have us believe like rustics, and ask no reason. But we say that in all things a reason must be sought. If reason fails, we must confide the matter to the Holy Ghost and faith. They say, "We do not know how this is, but we know that God can do it." You poor fools! God can make a cow out of a tree, but has he ever done so? Therefore show some reason why a thing is so, or cease to hold that it is so. Rejoicing not in the many, but in the probity of the few, we toil for truth alone. This was too strong for the stomach of William of Saint-Thierry. The zealous monk who had set St. Bernard to hound Abelard hastened to denounce this new rationalist to the watchful abbot of Clairvaux. William of Conches retracted his heresies, agreed that Eve had been made from Adam's rib, abandoned philosophy as an enterprise in which the profit was not commensurate with the risk, became tutor to Henry Plantagenet of England, and retired from history. Gilbert de la Porree, 1070 to 1154, managed the dangerous business more successfully. He studied and taught at Chartres and Paris, became Bishop of Poitiers, and wrote a Liber Sex Principiorium, or Book of 6 Principles, which remained for many centuries a standard text in logic. But his commentary on Boethius suggested that the nature of God was so far beyond human understanding that all statements about it must be taken as mere analogies, and so stressed the unity of God as to make the Trinity seem but a figure of speech. In 1148, though he was now 72, he was charged with heresy by St. Bernard. He stood trial at Auxerre, baffled his opponents with subtle distinctions, and went home uncondemned. A year later he was tried again, consented to burn certain passages torn from his books, but again returned a free man to his diocese. When it was suggested that he should discuss his views with Bernard, he refused, saying that the saint was too inexpert a theologian to understand him. Gilbert, said John of Salisbury, was so ripe in liberal culture as to be surpassed by no one. John might have spoken so for himself, since of all the scholastic philosophers he possessed the widest culture, the most urbane spirit, the most elegant pen. Born at Salisbury about 1117, he studied under Abelard at Mont-Sainte-Geneviève, under William of Conches at Chartres, under Gilbert de la Porree at Paris. In 1149 he returned to England and served as secretary to 2 archbishops of Canterbury, Theobald and Thomas a Becket. He undertook for them various diplomatic missions, visited Italy 6 times, and stayed at the papal court 8 years. He shared Becket's exile in France and saw him killed in his cathedral. He became Bishop of Chartres in 1176 and died in 1180. It was a full and varied career in which John learned to check logic with life and to take metaphysics with the modesty of an atom judging the cosmos. Revisiting the schools in his later years, he was amused to find them still debating nominalism versus realism. One never gets away from this question. The world has grown old discussing it, and it has taken more time than the Caesars consumed in conquering and governing the world. From whatever point a discussion starts, it is always led back and attached to that. It is the madness of Rufus about Nevia. He thinks of nothing else, talks of nothing else, and if Nevia did not exist, Rufus would be dumb. John himself settled the question simply. The universal is a mental concept conveniently uniting the common qualities of individual beings. John, rather than Abelard, proposed conceptualism. In the best Latin since Alcuin's letters, he composed a history of Greek and Roman philosophy, an astonishing evidence of the widening medieval horizon, a Metallogicon which lightened logic with autobiography, and a Polycraticus of 1159, whimsically subtitled De Nugis Curalium et Vestigiis Philosophorum, on the follies of courtiers and the vestiges of philosophers. This is the first important essay in political philosophy in the literature of Christendom. It exposes the errors and vices of contemporary governments, delineates an ideal state, and describes the ideal man. Today, he consoles us, everything is bought openly, unless this is prevented by the modesty of the seller. The unclean fire of avarice threatens even the sacred altars. Not even the legates of the apostolic see keep their hands pure from gifts, but at times rage through the provinces in bacchanalian frenzy. If we may believe his account, already quoted, he told Pope Hadrian IV that the Church shared liberally in the corruption of the times, to which the Pope in effect replied that men will be men however gowned. And John adds wisely, "In every office of God's household," meaning the Church, "while some fall behind, others are added to do their work. Among deacons, archdeacons, bishops, and legates, I have seen some who labored with such earnestness in the harvest of the Lord that from the merits of their faith and virtue it could be seen that the vineyard of the Father had been rightly placed under their care." Civil government, he thinks, is far more corrupt than the clergy, and it is good that the Church, for the protection of the people, should exercise a moral jurisdiction over all the kings and states of the earth. The most famous passages in the Polycraticus concern tyrannicide. If princes have departed little by little from the true way, even so it is not well to overthrow them utterly at once, but rather to rebuke injustice with patient reproof until finally it becomes obvious that they are obstinate in their evil-doing. But if the power of the ruler opposes the divine commandments and wishes to make me share in its war against God, then with unrestrained voice I answer that God must be preferred before any man on earth. To kill a tyrant is not merely lawful, but right and just. This was an unusually excitable outburst for John, and in a later passage of the same volume he added, "provided that the slayer is not bound by fealty to the tyrant." It was a saving clause, for every ruler exacted an oath of fealty from his subjects. In the 15th century, Jean Petit defended the assassination of Louis of Orléans by quoting the Polycraticus. But the Council of Constance condemned Petit on the ground that even the king may not condemn an accused person without summons and trial. We moderns cannot always agree with the moderni to whom John belonged in the 12th century. He talks now and then what seems to us to be nonsense, but even his nonsense is couched in a style of such tolerance and grace as we shall hardly find again before Erasmus. John, too, was a humanist, loving life more than eternity, loving beauty and kindness more than the dogmas of any faith, and quoting the ancient classics with more relish than the sacred page. He made a long list of dubitabilia, things about which a wise man may doubt, and included the nature and origin of the soul, the creation of the world, the relation of God's foresight to man's free will. But he was too clever to commit himself to heresy. He moved among the controversies of his time with diplomatic immunity and charm. He thought of philosophy not as a form of war, but as a balm of peace. Philosophia moderatrix omnium. Philosophy was to be a moderating influence in all things. And he who has by philosophy reached caritas, a charitable kindliness, has attained to philosophy's true end. 2. Aristotle in Paris. Toward 1150, one of Abelard's pupils, Peter Lombard, published a book which was at once a compilation of Abelard's thought, purified of heresy, and a beginning of the formal scholastic philosophy. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.